Yanai nanai, yanai nanai, yanai nanai, nanai nanai, yanai nanai, yanai nanai, yanai nanai, nanai nanai. Hiya ya 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 na 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 ya na 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 ya na 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 ya na 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 na. Na nine, na nine, na 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 nine, nine, nine. Shalom, shalom, beautiful friends. It's great to see you and be with you, and to be with you the day before Rosh Hashanah. What a special time to learn together. And today is the last session of our 10-part series on leadership lessons learned from Torah. Excited to tie this up together before we start next week our psychology studies and theories over the last century and Jewish wisdom on them. Torah of the mind. Very excited to launch into that with you all. Something I've been thinking about for about 17 years and looking forward to pulling it together. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the sad reality that Iran has launched a major missile attack on Israel right now. And our prayers are with our brothers and sisters in Israel, as there was just also a terrorist attack in Yaffo as well. And so while we're here joyfully learning Torah in America, we're aware that that's happening over there. And it's going to be a hard few days at the least. So our prayers are with them. Friends, today in session 10, our topic is a theory of leadership of persuasion over legislation. So let's start with a poll question to get our juices flowing a little bit. I prefer to option 1, advocate for change and avoid those who think really differently from me. Option 2, educate or persuade those who think really different. Option 3, I'm not sure I'm quite passionate enough or quite knowledgeable enough to advocate or educate. There's a word missing there, on anything. So what do you think? Do you prefer to advocate for change and just ignore the folks who think very differently? Do you prefer to educate or persuade those who think differently? Or do you feel like you're not really passionate enough or knowledgeable enough on any particular issues to advocate or educate? Would love to see how everyone here votes. Okay, very interesting. 11% prefer to advocate than educate. 78% prefer to educate people who think differently or create dialogue. And 11% are not so sure that they're passionate enough or knowledgeable enough for either. Okay, friends, there is a place for advocating, and we're going to look at a different approach today. There are many ways to invoke leadership, as we've explored. While we may imagine that to lead means to have authority over others, the truth is that leadership not always emerges from a place of coercion. After all, to exert our will over another is indeed coercion. At times, it's true that leaders must make decisions, often difficult ones, on behalf of others. However, when we envision the position that we lead from, I posit that we should emphasize persuasion rather than coercion. Leadership is more meaningful and effective when it comes not purely from a place of authority, but from a place of respect. In the Torah, we see this tension between persuasion and coercion played out when it comes to Jewish law. Often the Torah and the Talmud emphasize educating rather than legislating. In this way, leadership can be likened to parenting. It's rarely productive or helpful to force your child to do something. It can be much more effective to focus on educating, inspiring, and persuading the child. For example, forcing your child to say sorry after they hit another child at the playground does little to truly address the situation or help your child understand what it means to take accountability. Rather, it can be more successful to educate the child, taking a step back, talking through feelings, encouraging empathy, and ultimately arriving at an apology that shows they understand the hurt they caused. As with effective parenting, effective leadership will demonstrate respect for the autonomy of others and will in turn encourage others to do the same. The book of Proverbs, Sefer Mishlei, reminds us that teach a child according to their ways. It's not just that people need persuasion and education. It's that each person needs their own form of persuasion because we're all so different in how we can be persuaded. When we are in leadership positions, we should not think of those we are leading as pawns to be used toward our goals, the numbers we want to hit, or the place we wish to arrive at. Ideally, we will think of those whom we lead as partners. Even if that's not possible all the time, it should be the default. When it comes to Jewish legislation, referred to as halakha generally, and the mitzvot specifically, when the laws come directly from the Torah, it actually begins in a place without much legislation at all. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve only have one law, not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad. This is our first example of what is known as a negative commandment, a mitzvah lo ta'aseh. As I'm sure you know, we fail to keep it. By the time we reach Genesis 9, the number of laws progress. According to rabbinic elaboration on covenant between Noah and God in Genesis 9, the Noahides had 7 laws. Don't worship idols, don't curse God, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't eat the flesh of a living animal, and do establish courts of justice. Now, that last one actually has hundreds of rabbinic extensions, right? Interesting enough, of the 7 Noahide laws, the notion to do justice is one that the rabbis say includes hundreds within it. Not just on procedural justice, but various aspects of justice at large. It's almost as if God progressively understands that relying on human conscience is not enough and must move toward a more legislative vision. By the time we get to Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, we've entered the realm of legislation in the form of commandments. The corpus of these Torah commandments, known as mitzvot d'oraita, is robust. The Talmud says there's no less than 613 mitzvot d'oraita, although the rabbis do not explicitly name them in the Talmud. That comes later with the medieval rabbis. So just to sum that up, the idea is that we don't want legislation. God gave 1 law. It didn't work. So God gave 7 laws. It didn't work. So then there were 613, that humans need laws to actually cooperate. Conscience or love is not enough. These commandments govern many aspects of our interpersonal lives, from family dynamics to business practices. They coerce us into acting morally. Instead of people being inspired to love, love is commanded as a mitzvah. Love your fellow as yourself. Instead of responsibility to the poor being a charitable act that comes from the heart, it's now commanded in a variety of mitzvot, including not withholding charity from the poor and leaving unharvested crops from the gleaners. In Judaism, we're not only persuaded by our consciences to adhere to social norms, we are halakhically commanded from a traditional perspective. So that's to say, friends, that tzedakah should never be translated as charity. That's kind of a Christian interpretation. It should be interpreted as obligation, right? The justice, an obligation to pursue. That Judaism is rooted in laws and rules traditionally as a way of saying that human nature to just live by our better angels doesn't work without some form of order. The presence of legislation enshrined in the Torah shows us that, as important as persuasion is, there's a real place for law and authority. The question then becomes, how do we in our leadership, which is of course different than a divine construction of social norms, help inspire others to live in alignment with our highest values? In this context, we can see the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the 5 books of Torah, as a book in which Moses often repeats the laws that already exist, such that we learn how to persuade and educate. Why repeat them? In order to articulate it differently. For example, although in Leviticus we are given explicit instructions about how to conduct a harvest, such that we leave crops for the gleaners, leave food for the poor, in Deuteronomy we're given a more philosophical approach to the commandments of giving charity, even though I put down that word earlier. Do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kin. Rather, you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need. Leviticus leads by legislation, Deuteronomy by persuasion. They work together. Following the Torah, we enter the books of the prophets, who have their own unique approach to leadership, characterized by harsh rebukes, tochah. Consider, for example, the enraged admonishments of the so-called minor prophet, Hosea, who rails against Israel for a lack of faith in God. To be clear, the prophets are not offering us new law. The point of the prophets is that they cannot change what they receive. However, they can push the people to live up to their full potential. This is exactly what we hear from another minor prophet, Zechariah, who implores the people of Israel to be the best versions of themselves. Do not defraud the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor, and do not plot evil against one another. Notably, the prophets themselves have no formal authority. They are not kings or ministers. Given this, it's quite radical that they not only critique Bnei Yisrael as collective, but also speak truth to power by rebuking the leaders of their time. Every king is assigned a prophet to rebuke them. We might think of Natan holding King David accountable in the book of Shmuel, or the prophet Amos critiquing King Jeroboam at his royal palace in Bethel in the book of Amos. The great thinker Rabbi Avraham Heschel noted that the prophets tend to be distrustful of earthly power altogether. The prophets repudiate the work and power of human beings as objects of supreme adoration. They're not invoking human authority, but rather calling us back to ourselves and to the divine. Again and again, the prophets of the Bible use their own powers of persuasion to convince the people of their time, both the masses and the highest leadership, to reorient their values and their priorities. Moving on chronologically from the Bible and the prophets and into the world of rabbinic authority, we find that the rabbis of the Talmud had their own legislation. These are known as mitzvot de Rabbanan, the field of rabbinic legislation, how it interacts with the commandments of the Torah, which is a complex issue. Mitzvot d'oraita, mitzvot de Rabbanan. How does rabbinic law and biblical law interact? That's a whole massive subject in itself. Rather than covering all the philosophies that inform it, I just want to draw our attention to two specific rabbinic concepts when it comes to the commandments. One is lifnim mishurat hadin, and the second is hidur hamitzvah. Lifnim mishurat hadin literally means inside the line of the law. It refers to going above and beyond what the law actually requires. That is beyond the letter of the law. The concept comes to us from Bava Metzia, a tractate of the Talmud. In commentary on the concept of lifnim mishurat hadin, the Ramban, Nachmanides, explains that while we must keep the specific laws from Torah given to us, we must also acknowledge that it's impossible for the Torah to regulate every area of human behavior on both an individual and a communal level of what it means to be a mensch and a good person. Therefore, we should strive to act in accordance with Torah values, even in situations not explicitly governed by Torah law. An example given by the Ramban is that when selling property, we should give our neighbor the first right of refusal when selling this property. Now, hidur hamitzvah is the concept of beautifying the mitzvot. Jastro's dictionary refers to it as, quote, doing a religious act in the handsomest way. This principle encourages us to perform mitzvot in aesthetically pleasing ways, building a sukkah that is not only halachically sufficient, but also beautiful with art. Our sages ground this practice in a verse from Torah, specifically from the Song of the Sea. This is my God, and I will glorify him. What does it mean to glorify God, the rabbis of the Talmud ask? The answer, it means to perform the commandments as beautifully as possible. As with lifnim mishurat hadin, the rabbis of the Talmud acknowledge the distinction between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, encouraging us to act according to the spirit, beyond just the letter. In both of these cases, we see the rabbinic engagement with persuasion over legislation. Of course, the rabbis of the Talmud do believe in legislation. Much of their efforts were spent reinforcing Jewish legislation and even adding to it based on the needs of the time. However, the concept of lifnim mishurat hadin and hidur hamitzvah acknowledges that there are limits to what legislation can do. This is why we need a whole other category of the moral beyond the legal. Writing on halachic ethics in the 20th century, Rabbi Soloveitchik, known as the Rav, distinguished between the Masorah community of the rabbinic tradition and the political community of the Sadducees. By Masorah community, the Rav is referring to Jews who consider their central purpose in life to be the transmission of the Jewish tradition. He's contrasting this with the Sadducees, a powerful aristocratic sect who controlled the Temple of Jerusalem until its destruction by the Romans in 70 Common Era. The Rav argues that the latter chose political power as the center of their communal structure, while the rabbis chose education over political power. It would appear that persuasion over coercion is central to the whole project of rabbinic Judaism, which is to say, the endurance of the Jewish people. After all, it is thanks to the rabbis, not the Sadducees, that Am Yisrael has survived up to this present day. I also want to make my own plug here for Judaism over Israelism. Israelism is a growing phenomenon where people's nationalistic Zionism has become dominant over their commitment to Jewish values, essentially. That is to say that Judaism takes primarily a political approach rather than a religious approach. By religious approach, I don't mean here, I don't mean to make that synonymous with observant. I mean to say one whose life is guided by Jewish values, as opposed to a political orientation which views Jewish power as primary. And I think the Sadducees represented the approach of political power, whereas the Pharisees, the rabbis of the Talmud, emphasized the Jewish values and laws over the approach of power. And I think we see that in American Judaism today, where Israelism is winning over Judaism. More people are excited about it by an AIPAC conference than they are by Jewish learning. There are many ways to put the ideal of persuasion into practice. For example, when we're trying to make a difference, we want to ask ourselves how we can use methods that don't make people feel pressured or forced into compliance, rather inspired to do so. Some might ask, why should we bother to make them feel inspired? After all, if all we want to do is triumph in our cause, then who cares how we get it done? Let's just win the cause. We should simply force people to comply with what we think is right. Now, while I am in many ways sympathetic to this sentiment, we all want positive change, and we want it in our day. On an ideological level, coercing people to act justly recalls to me one of the great critiques of communism, that it strips away freedoms from the people in the name of equality for all. Not only that, but coercion is consistently shown to be less effective than persuasion. For example, behavioral science studies have found that when parolees were encouraged to adhere to the terms of their parole with fewer punishments and more incentives, things like words of affirmation and relaxed monitoring, they had far fewer parole violations. Happy to send you that study if you're interested. On a more spiritual level, we don't simply want a just system. We want people to be spiritually and morally transformed. And that requires a buy-in. We as a society want to cultivate intrinsic motivation, not merely reinforce a penalty-based approach. Consider the issue of welfare. We certainly need people to pay their taxes so that the government can protect the welfare of our most vulnerable residents. Therefore, we rightfully coerce people into paying their taxes under threat of fines and jail time. However, we also want to leave room for charitable acts beyond coerced taxation. Many of our debates today politically are about finding that balance. How do we cultivate an economically just society? So too, many people here may still cringe at the idea of walking into a shul on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur because we had such a harsh experience as a child. Our parent never taught us to love Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. They taught us we must go. right? Whether we like it or not, we must go because your parents went and your grandparents went, and you should feel guilty if you don't go, right? And so too, like just forcing kids to do Judaism as opposed to inspiring kids to love it is one of the messes we're still cleaning up from prior generations. It turns out that often what's economically just is also economically sound. We see this in the example of the industrialist Henry Ford, who revolutionized modern transportation with his Model T Ford. Of course, he was known to be a huge anti-Semite, but we may still have something to learn from him. We often say that in history. All right, here's a huge anti-Semite, but let's learn something from them anyways, because it's not so rare if you look at history that the people we want to quote, right, also thought Jews were bad. Of course, Ford famously reduced the workday at his company from a 9-hour workday to an 8-hour workday. Not only that, he doubled wages from $2.50 to $5 a day. This was an incredibly bold and unprecedented move on his part. Ford's peers in the industry thought it was an absurd mistake, with one rival automobile manufacturer calling the pay raise and shortened workday the most foolish thing ever attempted in the industrial world. Everyone assumed the guy was nuts, and he was driving his company into the ground. Instead, his company thrived. The factories became more efficient and effective, no longer suffering from the high turnover that had previously plagued the monotonous assembly line jobs. Ford's decision was an awakening of the idea that managing employees tighter and tighter, pushing them harder and harder, is not what makes more productive companies. Rather, it's by respecting people, their time, their needs, and their autonomy, that you create a workforce that is committed to the work. I do not know if Ford's motivation extended beyond its desire to reduce turnover at his assembly lines. Given his repugnant anti-Semitism, I'm not inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. But I do know that whether you're trying to build a successful company or a successful social change movement, you can't view the people you manage simply as resources. You must also see them as individuals whom you care about. By showing them you care, you can inspire them. To be clear, although some employers will reward good work equitably and believe in the power of persuasion rather than coercion, other employers do need to be pressured to treat their workers decently. Often, this is where a union comes in. There's a real challenge here in that employers feel truly threatened by unions, which creates a divide. But on the other hand, it's clear that many corporations will not honor the dignity of work unless they're forced to. This tension is a very tricky one to resolve. In order for us to build lasting movements of change, those movements need to be well managed. We must consistently remind ourselves that people need to be inspired. The inspiration is not built in, even if the cause is important. The work of participating in social change movements is exhausting. It's exhausting for so many reasons. A 2021 survey of nonprofits found that a whopping 48% of nonprofits are experiencing employee burnout. I can certainly share from my own experiences, as well as many people I've worked with and colleagues, the high levels of burnout in nonprofit work. Of course, it's true in for-profit work as well. Many of my colleagues who work in law or in medicine or as teachers, right? But just focusing on the nonprofit world for the moment. Speaking for myself, I can say that one of my own failings in some of the movement work I've done is that I've assumed everyone involved was always fired up and inspired, that our only job was to manage the work and delegate tasks. I assumed that the people we had to inspire were out there, not on the teams at the center of the movement. But I was wrong. It's the people at the center of the movement, myself included, who need to be cared for with continued inspiration, encouragement, and rest. I found myself burning out of energy on causes, and I watch others to do the same. When we might ask ourselves, what helps employees feel valued and cared for in the workplace? We might assume that the biggest priority is compensation. It's, of course, true that people need to be paid fairly for their time and effort in order to feel connected to any workplace. But interestingly, when it came to what makes the biggest impact on workplace satisfaction, it wasn't additional perks such as in-office yoga, pinball machines, fancier lunches. It was when an employer provided meaningful volunteer opportunities. In one study, David Jones at the University of Vermont and his colleagues showed that potential job applicants found companies with employee volunteering programs especially attractive because its purpose-driven approach they found it to be nurturing a meaningful culture that offers employees a larger sense of community identity. Similarly, in our own personal lives, we can't live from task to task, focusing on our to-do list. We have to figure out how, between all the obligations we manage, to include parts of our lives that sustain and energize us. We can learn a lot from the Jewish emphasis on learning. Someone might say, why should I learn Torah? I know what it means to be a good person. I'm going to just go out and do what I already know is good, not read about it, not learn about it. But even if we know what a social justice movement needs or feel we have a grasp of our own ethics, it's necessary to carve out contemplative space for reflection on our deepest values. Many of us want to get right into doing the work. However, if we manage tasks all day, we'll lose ourselves. Staying in touch with the values that persuade us is a powerful way to recharge ourselves. For some, staying in touch with these values might mean reading Torah, reminding ourselves that the Torah extols us, uvacharta b'chaim, to choose life. Always, it is a choice, not a compulsion, to choose life. We all have a domineering part of ourselves that wishes to push forward what we believe needs to be done in the world. However, as we have seen, this is not an effective approach to leadership generally. In Pirkei Avot, we are told, utsna et harabbanut. Literally, this would appear to mean hate the authorities. It's possible the directive was a polemic in its own time, referring to specific authorities of the day. Many people choose to translate it as hate acting the superior, meaning reject the voices in you that are seeking to dominate. Instead, take a gentler approach to social change. This may sound like it is advocating for a wishy-washy approach. Absolutely not. We must win. We must be strong and even forceful. There's real evil out there, and we must fight it. But we must do it in a way that wins hearts. Friends, one political comment in our day. It is easy that we can detest the other side so much that we actually think everyone who's running on our side is just a righteous, virtuous person. I know many people who've fallen into that trap, that literally everyone they're voting for on the ballot is like a saint. Right? These are not politicians with their own personal motives and incentives and drives for power. These are saintly people. They've elevated politicians to a level, like unprecedented levels, because of how much they hate the other side. Now, let me be clear, we should vote. We should get involved. We should support people we think are going to do better for our society. But we should also, as the rabbis encourage us, distance us from viewing authorities and people with political power as saintly people, right? Even though they may be virtuous. I suspect that one of the reasons the LGBTQ plus movement has been perhaps the most successful social movement of the past 20 years, is that it's incredibly persuasive in its emphasis on love. It hasn't been a rage movement, as I've emphasized before. It hasn't been a rage movement, even though it has every right to rage. It doesn't break windows and throw fireballs. It's a love movement, a pride movement. It's characterized by the hashtag love wins. The refrain of the fight for marriage equality, which finally ended in victory in 2015. Yes, that fight was for legislation for marriage equality. However, legislation is an anxiously uncertain solution, and it can be overturned by a bad government. The true victory is the extent to which people who identify as straight have realized they have nothing to fear from their queer neighbors, friends, relatives, and colleagues. Friends, to conclude here, ultimately, leadership is like almost any other endeavor. It's about the heart. Rav Kook taught us the purpose of the Torah is to raise the human heart, to refine it and bring it to its most worthy level. That's what Torah is about, according to Rav Kook. And I think he's right. The purpose of the Torah is to raise the human heart, to refine it and bring it to its most worthy level. It is a rigorous discipline, spiritual discipline, that is about cultivating that inner life. To lead is not to dominate or control, but to help those around us and ourselves refine our hearts and align with our highest values. In this way, we can lead in healthy, sustaining, and deeply persuasive ways. Okay, dear friends, I'm going to pause there. I hope that you'll raise questions, thoughts, agreements, disagreements, not only about this issue of persuasion and the many different issues we touched on this issue, but about leadership in general, because we're wrapping up, this 10-part series on leadership. And just to sum up my main argument here, is that it is very easy to be commentators and to be offer polemics, and to sit and watch, the news and just shake our heads at leaders out there, the CEOs and the politicians. But the argument is that the Jewish approach is that all of us lead. We all follow, we all participate. We are all involved in exercising leadership in the community, the Jewish community, in our local society, and nationally and globally. And what it means to be a Jew is to take responsibility. And to engage the wisdom of our tradition so that we can leave the world better than when we left it, through kindness, through justice, through education, through all these different approaches we've taken. All right, friends, I'd like to pause and hear from you. Hi, Eileen, and then Steve.
It seems to me that the use of persuasion can be used to format legislation. And if it's used well, then it should result in better legislation.
Yeah, Eileen. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that comment. I really appreciate that. I think you're exactly right. That they're not just separate realms. They're complementary, and they can enhance each other. And engaging in our Talmudic approach of debate and social discourse and learning and building bridges among ideological divides can not only complement but enhance that very legislation that emerges. I think that's true. And yes, please.
Respectful persuasion.
Yes, it's respectful. And although some of our past Arizona senators might not be so popular here, I do want to say, to the credit of Sinema and Flake and McCain and some others, that although I didn't always agree with certain approaches, like the desire to do things in a bipartisan way, is a really good inclination, right? It shouldn't be the answer to every problem, but the desire to actually have parties persuade each other to compromise and figure out solutions together, as opposed to one side always winning and one side was losing. Sometimes it has to be that way. I think it's a really good inclination, even if it's an overused tactic by some. So thank you for that, Eileen. And I think that's legislation that can be more lasting when there is, and let's bracket the filibuster unless you want to weigh in on it. But I think the conversation right now about the filibuster is a really interesting one to test out this notion of, do we just want to win, or do we want to engage some work beyond winning of kind of a collaborative persuasive process? And to be fair, like I'm a little torn. I think a really good case could be made both ways on filibuster issues. Okay, yes, Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand and agree with your suggestion that we embrace tradition, or maybe Judaism says embrace our tradition as a means of being the best we can and leading. But does that mean we should look askance at change? To me, change is very much an important part of being alive. And not only do we look back to grab onto things that are meaningful, but we look at things that provide us with new insight as well. So it's not really a question. It's just sort of a rambling statement.
There's nothing rambling about that beautiful statement, Steve. Thank you so much. I actually think that this is one of the great things Judaism has to offer the world, where I think conservatives and progressives fundamentally get it wrong. Oftentimes, the progressive orientation is that the newest thing is the best. You constantly want. Well, friends, this has never happened, but the power just went out in our office. And so here we are. Never a dull moment over here. So I'm very sorry about that. I hope you can see me well enough in the dark. And I'm very sorry about that. In any case, Steve, what I think you were saying was brilliant and awesome. And as I was saying, there is a zeitgeist today that the newest thing is the best thing, that change is always the best. And I think that's a problematic approach. There's also a conservative inclination to say that we always want to preserve the past, right? That whatever was the oldest or lasting is what we should hold on to. And I think Judaism has a lot of wisdom here on this idea of balancing the new with the old, of balancing change with preserving. And change is necessary and beautiful and powerful, and also preserving the good is so important and necessary. And finding the right pace of change, I think, is so crucial, that if we change too fast, we lose a lot. And if we change too slow, we lose a lot too. And so, Steve, I'd love to hear your thought on that, on how you think about that balance between preserving and changing.
I probably err on the side of change because I don't believe in a personal God. I've ascribed all of the strength and power of a personal God to evolution and eternity. To me, that is as close to a God as I feel comfortable with. And so, in answering your question, I'd say I probably look at change more than tradition, but I never look askance at tradition. There's so much value there.
Oh, Steve, that's so interesting. I never really put that together. But yes, that idea actually, that the embrace of evolution, and kind of prioritizing evolution over a personal God is actually making a case for why change is not only inevitable but good, and to be prioritized over preserving, because from the evolutionary perspective, that will produce the greatest good ultimately. Now I do have questions and thoughts about that approach, but nonetheless, I think that's very thoughtful and interesting. So thank you, Steve. Yeah, very good. Dr. Janie Heydrich, hello.
Hi. If you don't mind, I'm going to read what I put in the chat, because it took me a long time to get those thoughts together. In the advocacy, legislative power, persuasion debate, where does the power of modeling enter in? Leading by example rather than legislation or advocacy is certainly slower, but otherwise, are we not setting ourselves up to be in a tense, violent situation, us versus them? The egotistical assumption that we are right, whereas they are not.
Right.
There's the age-old debate that religion hinders people from understanding and achieving love for others by placing a layer of laws that substitute for a self-enlightened commitment to love and goodwill. So, for example, telling a child, say you're sorry, that is not a genuine internal response from that child. It is something that's been superimposed on the child. That's why I loved the quote that you had by Rav Kook. The purpose of the Torah is to raise the human heart, to refine it and bring it to its most worthy level. I don't see in that the conflict of proselytizing through legislation, through talking about religion or anything else. So talk to
me. Great. That's so interesting what you shared. I'm so glad you shared that, because I never saw it in the chat, I guess, when I lost power. But I think that's to both of your points. Firstly, on modeling, I love that. I think when I say persuading, what it might sound like I primarily mean is intellectual persuasion, right? I'm going to debate someone and persuade them to think like me, right? But I think that not only has the risk of being arrogant, it also pedagogically and psychologically can be weak. And so I think the notion of modeling, us actually living what we think is best and learning from other models as well, can be far more persuasive. And when I look at my life and changes I made, they were far more because of people I was influenced by, who modeled something that I wanted to be like, or were doing something that I wanted to do. That was far more persuasive than any kind of lecture I received. Now, to your second point,
I think it's really interesting, and it's a good critique I want to make of my earlier idea, which I think may have been more too cognitive and not behavioral enough. It's true that that we may want to, learn from the mind and learn from the heart, but there is a case for behavioral as well. Here we're getting into the psychology studies to come. It may actually be that forcing a child to do something enough times will cultivate it in them more deeply than letting them come around to it themselves. I was previously arguing that just making a kid say sorry is, not a good approach. They should really learn, right? But the behavioralist would say that actually, forcing students, or forcing might sound a little harsh, gently prompting and encouraging students to do the right things will produce a better person than merely waiting for them to kind of come around and learn it on their own. A good case could be made both ways. And I think from my own life, that's true as well. There were things I was forced to do as a kid and as a young adult that I didn't want to do at all. But by doing them over and over, it cultivated commitments in me. And I'm glad that I learned to do that. And anyways, so much more to say about that. But let me pause there.
Well, I was thinking particularly about what you and Shoshana did. And when you wrote about the time that you were looking around saying, what more can I do? What can I give? Somebody wasn't telling you to do that. That was a manifestation of who you were inside, that you wanted to do that. Nobody told you to do that. Nobody advocated it. And yet the example that you and Shoshana have given to other people is incredible, by modeling, by doing that.
Well, thank you, Janie, for those kind words about Shoshana. And I think it's absolutely true about her that she did this for no other reason than a true empathy for whoever is struggling out there. And and felt no compulsion or forced or in any kind of way. And I think that actually I am glad you brought that up, because I'm in a minority view in the organ donation world where I advocate for a legislative change that there ought to be the right to paying for transplants. There ought to be compensation for donors. Now, the mainstream view, against my view, is that, wait a minute, let's keep this altruistic. There'll be too much compulsion. There'll be too much too much extortion, and there'll be too much. I'm blanking on commodifying and too much commodifying. And in the global South, there'll be far too many injustices and discrepancies in terms of who's giving and who's getting, in terms of a global inequality. And lots to say about that side and the merits of the side to say that we shouldn't, commodify it. But my argument on the other side is that I care much less about the good intentions of people and much more about saving more lives. And if some people will only donate an organ if they're going to get 25 grand out of it, then let's enable that and save a life, and then deal with the potential inequalities that might address the system later. So yes, on the one hand, like Janie said, I want to encourage people to be more like Shoshana, where like they want nothing in return, and like all of you, really knowing you, that they want nothing in return. They just want to do good because that's how they understand their lives, and yet, on the other hand, I want to think of ways that we can socially incentivize people to want to do more good, even for impure motives, so that good things can get done more. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that tension. But yeah, over to you, Stan, and then Judy.
Okay, I think the art of persuasion really requires you to find somebody who is persuadable. So you have to have somebody who is not so stuck in his or her positions that you can't even talk to them.
Right.
Secondly, you need to take baby steps when you try to persuade. And the way to take baby steps is find out what you agree on, because there is something you must agree on. Thirdly, I didn't really like your praise of Henry Ford. He was a virulent, vicious anti-Semite. And that's, to me, it's like when the ADL decided to play footsie with Elon Musk. I think you have to be real careful when you do that. And you're speaking to someone who has driven a lot of Ford Mustangs, but that's my feeling about it.
Well, you've never offered me a ride in a Ford Mustang or my kids, because when we drive down the road, my two sons point out, and every time we pass a Mustang, they call it Mustang and are very excited. So if they find out you have one, they're going to want to ride. But yes, I am in the camp that I am personally in the camp that we can learn from people in history who also were bigots. I mean, we'd be writing off a lot of people throughout history who were just sexist and racist and anti-Semites if we couldn't learn something from them as well. I did give the caveat twice that he was, a really big anti-Semite. But I hear your point as well. Like, it does really taint what the lesson is. And so yeah. Anyways, yeah. And Musk is I don't want to get into Musk right now. I am obsessed with following his tweets, and I really shouldn't be, partially because it gives me an insight into what certain people are thinking in America right now, the way he articulates things. An insight that I wish I didn't have, perhaps, but I just can't stop. It's the only tweets I look at these days are his, because I think there's millions of people following him, given how strong his platform is. And he's just influencing a whole new social discourse in ways we couldn't have imagined. Anyways, thank you, Stan. Yes, Judy.
Well, to build on what Stan was saying about someone can't be persuaded unless they're persuadable, I think we also can't persuade anybody of anything without trying to understand where they're coming from. We are comfortable as Jews with disputation and with conflict. We don't take the fact of conflict personally, but there are other people who come from a world that values consensus over disagreement, and there are people who are uncomfortable with the approach that we have. And I think that we have to think about where they are, and you have to take someone's hand if you're going to walk together. You can't say, march behind me and expect them to march. Adults can't be forced to change. They have to be encouraged or persuaded or charmed into changing. We have to be listening a lot.
Beautiful. That's so well articulated, Judy. Thank you for that. And one of the goals of this series has been to show how many different ways there are to lead. There are some folks here who want to politically organize or want to march, at a women's march or racial justice march, whatever it is. And, there are folks here, who really are not really into that kind of thing and might really want to really get closer to people and understand how they're thinking and understand how their thinking can change, and very gently engage in that long run of a process. And to be, and to identify who's persuadable and who's not. And to also within ourselves identify what parts of us are still persuadable and what parts are not. There's parts of my life and my commitments that are really not persuadable. They're kind of like, for better and worse, parts that are just kind of rock solid in who I am as a person, in my personality, in my thinking, and my values. And there's other parts that are deeply persuadable. I'm still working them out. I feel very open. I'm in diverse relationships. And it's good for us to, identify those within ourselves as well. Both because we should build on the parts that are kind of solid, and we should open up spaces of learning for the parts that are persuadable. Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl.
I just wanted to weigh in on what Jamie so eloquently said. I couldn't have said it even close to that well, but I really, truly believe that leadership by modeling is probably what I probably ascribe to more than anything else. In my younger days, I did a lot of leading in the Jewish community, leading organizations and leading things like that. But I think the biggest impact, is the impact that, that Stan and I set it's setting an example. So how our, what we believe, whether our families, whether our kids follow or not, we've at least made it clear this is where we're coming from. And, I'm also open to, and I feel like that makes more of an impression. And I just like how Jamie said it, but I also feel like, when you want to do something, it doesn't necessarily have to be as a leader either. A participant is really good. If somebody's setting an example, it means, to take your point, that you're open to participating in something that maybe you hadn't ever done before, or maybe you hadn't thought about in a certain way before, but you're open to trying it. And so that, that becomes a new value of yours. And then you can pass that along as, in modeling what you do. So
beautiful, Cheryl. I love that. Thank you. Just before we go to Gary, just, 2 thoughts on that. Going back to Janie's point about Shoshana, the last thing in the world Shoshana ever would have wanted me to do is post on Facebook that she had donated a kidney, but I had to persuade her that the goal was not to just save this one life, but to save others. And because I posted about her act, other people have reached out to me who are now, getting tested and pursuing this. And so this is something we struggle with at VBM. How do we not engage in virtue signaling where we're like, oh, look at us, look at the great stuff we're doing here, but also persuade people to participate? And it's a really difficult thing. And, and so that's why we believe in celebrating people. Like we like to celebrate people and their acts of service, because we think it's modeling. The people actually right here on this call are so many who we have and continue to celebrate, because it creates models for people who can be inspired and persuaded to do these good acts. But how do we do it in a way that's not just arrogant and attention-seeking? Look at me, I'm doing something good, but actually, trying to publicly demonstrate that modeling. It's great to be humble and quiet about our good deeds, but it's also great to find a way where they can, inspire others as well. So I'm a big fan of people's giving, and service being public. Gary, over to you.
Morning, everyone. A couple things. One is, I think what some of us are talking about, you just can't talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. And there's lots of different ways to say that, but, we live by example. And you hope to, and as Judy said, you can't, you have to bring them along with you. And it may not be the first time, or it may not be the 1,000th time, but hopefully there'll be some change in whatever you model, as Cheryl just said. And a little different from what Stan said is I don't think we ever can give up on people. There's been bigots and anti-Semites, but history tells us that some people can be turned around and or at least changed or moved a little bit. So I don't think we can give up on people. Is there pure evil? Yeah, there's people that are just pure evil. You may never, but I still have to have hope that we can change the world, and we change the world by changing people. And the last thing, I wanted to go back with what Steve had mentioned about change, about conservative and progressive. I think that past is important, but if we get stuck in the past, we never grow, we never change, and which is some of my arguments against extremely right-wing Jewish colleagues of ours that want to live in the past, that don't want to embrace any progressive ideas, be it a cell phone or the movies or TV. Better yet, changes in society that have happened right along, and I think I feel sad many times in a very stuck world and haven't grown. They may have grown in terms of Torah or Talmud, but in their own community, do they really help change the thoughts of the world? And because we all change. So that was my soapbox. So Shana Tova to everyone.
Good. Awesome. Thank you, Gary. And then I'm going to, just before I conclude, I'm going to offer Matthew a chance to speak because we haven't heard from him yet. But I appreciate both your points, both your counter argument, your rebuttal to Stan, the Stan's great point that some people are not persuadable, and your great counter argument that, that maybe people are more persuadable than we think. And I think that's a great tension to hold, and a good argument that I want to hear the two of you debate this out together in public. We'll have a whole program about it. And then I also appreciate your support of Steve's point there around change. I think this is very much what BBM is trying to be, a place that is pushing the Jewish thinking and world to the next stage. A forward-looking, that's explicitly in our mission statement, a forward-looking approach to Jewish life. Not just change for change's sake, but forward-looking of what's the change we need, what's the most important change, and how can we help the community feel prepared to get there. Yes, Matthew, last comment from you.
I was just going to say, leadership and persuasion involves fundamental trust in what the person is saying, and they're going to be honest with themselves and with you. Because without that trust, there's doubt in everything. As long as someone is going to be true to themselves and trustworthy and consistent and explain if they make changes, then that trust will work and you can persuade someone.
Wow. That is a great point to end on today, because I think that's exactly right. It comes back to the midot of our Musar tradition that bitachon, trust, has to be rebuilt in families, in friendships, in society, in community. That there has to be a level of trust in order for persuasion or the discussion of ideas to even happen. Because if we don't trust someone else's goodness, we don't trust the integrity of their ideas, we don't trust, facts or truth or whatever it is, it's very hard to rebuild a discourse around ideas and values. And so how do we rebuild that trust? Matthew, I really appreciate that point. And on that, that's a little of my blessing for everyone here in the coming year, that we rebuild a trust in ourselves, a trust in our own goodness, a trust in the capacity for goodness, the capacity for change, and a trust that hearts can be moved and systems can be changed, and that each of us has a role to play in that. Each of us has a role to play in bringing more light than darkness, and bringing more repair than destruction. And I wish everyone a Shana Tova, a better year than this last year, although you may have had a good year personally, but collectively a better year in so many ways. And may we continue to learn together and continue to inspire each other, and wishing good health and strength to everyone.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Be well. Thank you so much.